it doesn't show your faces, so you still answer and everything. So we're going to take the middle term of 6, divide it by 2, which is 3, and then 3 squared is 9. So that means 9 is going to go in this position right there. And then the value that goes in here inside the parentheses is going to be the value that you had before you squared it. So it's always going to be this step 2. So 3 is going to go in the position here. And because it's a positive 3, we're going to write plus 3. And that's the quickest way to do it. Now, when it tells you to factor, we always can factor the old-fashioned way. So our old way of doing this is we can say, A times C is 9, factors of 9 are 1 and 9, or 3 and 3, and I need a pair that gives me 6. And I could do my box, and all of it's the same. Like I can say, this is x squared, this is 9, 3x, 3x, take out greatest common factor. Just like you guys already know how to do. Okay? And then notice that you've got along this side, you have x plus 3, and along the top, you have x plus 3, which means you have 2 of them, which is the same thing as this. So the only thing that I'm saying is instead of having to factor the old-fashioned way every single time with a box, if you're completing the square, you get to do it quicker. All right? And in this case, it's perfect scenario because everything came out nice. Does anybody have any questions on that? You can do the old way, but I'm just going to recommend if you can do it the faster way, why not? Okay, if I do letter B, I've got x squared minus 9x plus, I'm trying to figure out what goes in that position. And the nice way is I can just write this as x and then something in here. And so I want to find what goes in that spot. And the easiest way to do it is take the middle term, which is negative 9, divide it by 2, and then square it. Now, is negative 9 divided by 2 a nice number? Does it come out like 2 or 4 or 5? It doesn't. It comes out as a decimal, right? It comes out as negative 4.5. So if I know it's not going to divide in evenly, a lot of times I will just write it, I'll just square the top. So negative 9 times negative 9 is 81, and 2 times 2 is 4. And so I will just write this as 81 over 4. Could you write this as 20.25? You could. I usually just write it as a fraction. And then when I go to put it inside, it's before you square it. So that means it's this value right here that you're going to write inside. And because it's a minus, then it's a minus inside. So basically the sign that's inside parentheses is always going to be the sign of whatever your B value is, because you're always going to be adding a positive number to the end. Any questions on example 1? Was there a question? Okay. So with that being said, what we're going to do is we're going to, let's try one of these. Let's try number 2 on your own. And we'll give you about 3 minutes. So everybody should be trying it. Do as far as you can go. If you finish, try number 3. So we're all trying number 2. If you finish, try number 3. It's like a little bonus. Make sure you're good with a fraction.
And then our next step is we're gonna add, but we're not doing. Everyone have it for.
Okay, does anybody have a first step for me? What do we do first? Good. So -4 divided by 2. And then we square it. So -4 divided by 2 is? -2. Good. And when we square it, we get +4. We're always going to get a positive number, right? Because a negative times a negative is always a positive. And then what's going to go inside parentheses? Good. That -2. Okay? Always. All right. Did anybody have a chance to try 3? Should we go through it or do we feel okay? Go through it?
Number 3. We're still discussing number 2.
Oh, do we have a question on 2?
First is discussion. We might need number 3. Yeah. Okay, so we're good, so we need number 3? I think we need number 3.
Okay. So when we look at number 3, remember, we again, same idea. We take the middle term, which is 7. We divide it by 2, and then we square it. And 7 divided by 2 doesn't come out even. So I'm going to go 7 squared, which is 49, 2 squared, which is 4. And I usually just do that because if this happened to be like 7 over 3, if I divide that, that's not, it's not a nice clean number. It's an approximation. And so I just usually, in my head, figure out if it's a fraction and I can't go further, I just leave it as a fraction. And so this is going to be 49 over 4. Could you write that different? Yes, you could. I mean, you could write it if you really, really wanted to. You could write this as 12.25. That's fine. And same thing, if I put this in, it's a positive 7/2. So this is a positive 7/2 because it's always what happens before you actually do the squared part. Or you also could write that as x plus 3.5. And I wasn't sure if it would take a decimal, but as long as it's a clean decimal, it sounds like the computer will take it. I wasn't positive about that, but seventh period seemed like that was fine. Is that sound okay? Are we feeling okay about that? Yeah? Okay, we're going to continue on. It's going to be the same throughout the section. So you'll notice that as I look at example 2, very similar, but instead of it being equal, or instead of it not having an equal sign, is going to be equal to a number over here that they're calling D. So we're still going to look for C. So I'm still going to go x squared minus 16x, and I'm going to leave a space for the C value. And because you now have an equation, when I add something to the left-hand side, I also have to add it to the right-hand side, because remember, with an equation, we have to keep it balanced on both sides. So if I add it to the left, I also have to add it to the right. Other than that, everything else is the same. And a lot of you guys like to squish everything on your paper. I'm just going to recommend, like, when you write your problem, write it with these little spots here, because it helps you remember that you need to put it on both sides, because if you don't put it on both sides, then you're going to get it wrong. So once I'm there, I take the middle term, just like before. We divide it by 2, just like before. Negative 16 divided by 2 is negative 8. And then we square it just like before. And that's going to go on the left-hand side and also on the right-hand side to keep my equation balanced. I'm going to rewrite my left-hand side just like we did before. So this is going to be x, and the value that goes in here is this step right here, step 2, which is minus 8. And then on the right-hand side, am I going too fast? Okay. On the right-hand side, we're going to combine this, whether you do that with your calculator or if you're good with adding and subtracting integers. 64 minus 15, you have $64, you spent 15 of it. That means you have 49 left. And now we're back to what we did last time in class, which is I have a squared term that's isolated and I need to solve, because again, it tells me that I'm solving. So how do we get rid of a power of 2? Square root. And so are we good? We have questions? Okay, so we get x minus 8. Because I drew the square root sign, this is plus or minus 7. And now we're trying to get x all alone. How do I get that x to go away? How do I get the x all alone? I need to get rid of the minus 8. Good. So we're going to add 8 to both sides. And so what this does is it gives me x is equal to 8. The plus or minus is attached to the 7. So when I break this down, it's 8 plus 7, which gives me 15. And again, you can just use a calculator. And then 8 minus 7, which is 1. So my solutions would be x equals 15 and x equals 1. Okay, so notice that just what we started with is really just the same. The only extra piece is, now that you have an equal sign, if you add it to the left, you also have to add it to the right. Not a big deal. Okay, when I look at example 3, same idea, but notice now you don't have a value over here. It said equal to 0. So I want to make sure that there's a couple things. One is this idea. Before you can complete the square, the x squared term has to be a 1. And the way we make it a 1 is we're going to divide everything by a. Okay, whatever the a value is. So if I look at this equation, the a value is what's in front of x squared, so that's a 2. So I have to first divide everything by 2 before you can do anything. You may want to put a little star here or something to remind yourself that a has to be 1 in order for me to complete the square. So I get x squared plus 10x minus 4 equals 0. And now when I look at this, a couple things hopefully are kind of running through your head. If I wanted to factor this, are there factors of 4 that give you 10? Hopefully in your head you're like, no, because the only factors of 4 are 1 and 4 or 2 and 2, and I can't get 10. So what that tells me is I have to try completing the square. Plus, it tells me that. So I'm going to move this value over to the other side so that I can now complete the square. I want to make sure that what's on the left-hand side is a nice, beautiful, perfect square. And so notice I'm gonna move the 4 over, so now the C value is empty, and I'm just gonna hold its place with a little empty space, okay? Whether that's a line, whether you just leave a blank space there, but do something so you know that you've got something you need to put there. And then when I go 0 plus 4, I get 4, and then again, if I add it to the left, I also have to add it to the right. And now we're back to normal, complete the square. Take the middle term, divide it by 2, and then square it. 10 divided by 2 comes out nice, it's 5. When I square it, I get 25. And again, if you're not great with your integer operations, there's nothing wrong with use your calculator. If you don't know that 10 divided by 2 is 5, or that's just something that for whatever reason, today's a rough day, then use your calculator. Okay, hopefully that's not too rough for you. But some days, there's just days that just things don't work out the way you thought they did. So we get 25. We're going to add it to the left. We're going to add it to the right because we have to keep it balanced. We rewrite the left. When I rewrite the left, what do I write? What's going to go inside parentheses? Plus 5. Yep, this step right here. And then 4 plus 25 is 29. So now when I go to solve this, I'm trying to get rid of power of 2. So I square root, and I get x plus 5 is equal to, I drew the square root sign, which means I have to take into account for both of them, root 29. And then when I do this, I'm going to try to get the x all alone. And so I have to subtract 5 from both sides. And so I get negative 5 plus or minus root 29. Now, in this case, it doesn't tell me that I need to round, but if it says write the answer and if needed, write it as a decimal, then that means if you can't get a nice, beautiful answer, then we're going to plug it into the calculator and get a nice, beautiful answer. And the nice, beautiful answer is not going to be positive or negative of the same thing. So what's going to happen, and I should have done it this way to begin with, is how come that's not working the way I want it to? All right, so what I want to do is share my whole screen with you guys for just a second so that you guys can see the calculator. Can you guys see the calculator okay?
No.
You can now? All right, so we're going to put that in. So I'm going to go negative 5 plus the square root of 29. And so when I do that, it tells me, usually we round to the hundredths place, and you'll notice that the problems down below, it tells you to do that. So that means you look at the third number over, and that 5 is going to make the 8 bump up. So this is going to be 0.39. And then you're going to do it again. So I don't have positive 0.39 and negative 0.39. I'm going to type it in again. I'm going to go negative 5, but instead of adding root 29 this time, I'm going to subtract root 29. And it's extremely important that you guys understand that that's two separate problems. Adding and subtracting root 29 is different. I don't just write plus 0.39 and minus 0.39 or negative 0.39. So in this case, I look at the third number over, which is a 5, and it's going to bump the 8 up. And so I get negative 10.39. In this case, the number after the decimal happens to be the same. Now, that's not going to happen every time. That's just coincidence, okay? But these are your solutions if it's not exact, okay? If it asks for exact, then this would be my exact answers, okay? These are rounded, and that's why you have the little squiggly lines, okay? This is rounded. And it'll usually tell you if you're going to have an exact answer or a rounded answer. And your book, for whatever reason, tends to be, if it doesn't come out like beautiful, like we did on the problems above, then you're going to round it. As you progress through math, that's usually not the case. We usually leave it as -5 plus root 29. We usually don't like to write it as a decimal because it's not as accurate. And mathematicians are usually pretty accurate until the very, very end. And so usually we don't do this, do rounded, but this book tends to be okay with it. All right, so let's, why don't you guys try number 4? And let's just give you, again, about 3 minutes and go as far as you can go. And if you finish it, then move on to number 6 and go as far as you can go. Preferably all the way, but. So everybody try it, get as far as you can go. If you get stuck on 4, go as far as you can go on 6. Don't forget the point. Yes. Okay. We're just taking the B number, which is yeah, I'm going to make this. Now I'm going to Okay, guys, let's look at number 4. Remember that what is our very first step? Yeah. Okay, do we need a second more? Or are we good? Okay, we're going to take the middle term of negative 2 and we're going to divide it by 2 and square it. So this is negative 1 squared, which is 1. And so we're going to add 1, add 1. Left-hand side, we're going to rewrite. And remember, it's this value right here before you square it. So it's going to be x minus 1. And then 3 plus 1 on the right-hand side is a 4. And then now we're back to what you guys did last class, which is get rid of the power of 2 by square rooting. So we get x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus 2. And then we're going to add 1 to both sides to get our final answer. So what did you guys get for your answer? What'd you get? 1 plus 2, right? Which is 3, and 1 minus 2, which is negative 1. We good there? Okay. Did anybody have a chance to get going on 6? Okay, so let's, I kind of tried to show you that first step. Divide everything by 3. So we get g squared minus 8g plus 9 equals 0. And then remember, we want to get that 9 to the other side because we're trying to figure out what would normally go in that spot so that you can solve. Yeah. All right, so this is going to go g squared minus 8g. We're trying to figure out what goes in here is equal to negative 9. And remember, if I add it to the left, I also have to add it to the right. So what number do I end up adding to both sides? We take the middle term, we divide it by 2, and we square it. Okay, so that means we're going to add 16 to the left, and we're going to add 16 to the right. And then we rewrite the left, and it's always this little guy here before we square it. So it's g minus 4 squared, and then negative 9 plus 16. So you have $16 and you spend 9 of it. So how much is left? So you've got 7 left. We feeling okay about that? To get rid of the power of 2, we're going to take the square root. So we get g minus 4 because we drew the square root sign, and it's always the same. If we draw the square root sign, then I have to do plus or minus 7. And 7 doesn't break down because it's prime. So we're done at that point. And then we're going to add 4 to both sides. So I'm going to go add 4, add 4. And because this is a radical, that kind of tells me that I'm going to have not a nice answer. And so we're going to have to do this whole round to the nearest hundredth. So I have 4 plus or minus root 7. So this is 4 plus root 7 and 4 minus root 7. And again, these are going to give me, approximation numbers. So in my calculator, I'm going to go 4 plus root 7 and get my answer. So notice in this case, if I'm going hundredths, that 5 is going to round the 4 up to a 5. So this is going to be 6.65. And then when I go to do the other one, remember you're going 4 minus root 7. And so this time that 4 is going to leave the 5 where it is. So it's going to be 1.35. And these are my solutions that I would put in my computer. All right, because we're going to round it to the nearest hundredth if it doesn't come out nice and beautiful integers. Any questions on 4 or 6? Do we feel like we're doing okay? Okay, so this is, I've got a blank paper. There we go. Okay, so the next part of what we're talking about is finding the max and min values. And I talked about that a little bit on how we know if it faces up or down, if it's a max or min. And we did that like very first section of the year when we did transformations, which I don't know if that's necessarily the greatest place to introduce that, but that's where we introduced it. So remember that we talked about if that A value was positive, then my U or my shape, whatever it happened to be. So if A was positive, then it faced up. And if A was negative, then it faced down. Okay, whether that was a U or a V, a square root sign, whatever it was, right? A line, it would either slant up from left to right or slant down from left to right based on what this value in the very front was. And that's kind of the same idea. So as I look at example 4, this one tells us we have a minimum value. And so a minimum value means that that the A value in front of x squared is a positive, which in this case, you'll notice it is. So it's a positive 1. And now we're going to just do this same exact thing. I want my equation to look like vertex form because the vertex is the HK, or that's that lowest point. So this is HK. All right, or this is HK. It's the highest or lowest point. And your formula is always the same. It's always x minus h squared plus k. And for us, we want A to be 1 or negative 1. So as I look, my very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to rewrite. And remember, I want to complete the square. So I'm going to try to figure out what goes here. Okay, sorry. I want to figure out what goes here to make it a perfect square. Okay, so I'm going to add a value here. And because I'm going to strictly use or manipulate the values on the right-hand side of the equal sign, I'm also going to, I didn't want to write equals, sorry. I'm also going to go -1. And if I add a number to the right, then I also have to subtract the number from the right so that they cancel each other out. It's like I'm adding 0. I'm just rewriting it in a different form. And this is kind of the key part of doing the max and min, is I'm going to add and subtract the same number on the same side of the equation. Other than that, everything else is the same. So when I look at this, I'm still going to do the same thing. I'm going to take the middle term of 4, I'm going to divide it by 2, and I'm going to square it. So that's 2, I square it, I get 4. So none of that's changing. And so I'm going to add 4, and if I add 4, I'm going to subtract 4, because what's positive 4 and negative 4 are the same as 0. Okay, 4 minus 4 is 0. So I make it look different, but I really haven't changed anything. And then I'm going to do the same thing that we've been doing. I'm going to group or look at these two and rewrite it in a different way. I want it to be something squared, which is what I have up here as x minus h squared. I'm trying to get it to look like that. So this is x, and what goes inside parentheses? Same thing, that's step 2, positive 2. And then I take the values at the end, so -1 minus 4, which is -5. And so I've got my equation in vertex form. This is called vertex form. I have it in vertex form, which helps me find the vertex. So in this case, or the max or min point. So in this case, my vertex, which is the minimum, okay, because I know that it faces up, is the point, and I need to figure out what that point is. And so notice that inside it says the h value is the opposite of what number is inside. So the opposite of 2 is -2, and then it's whatever the value is on the outside. So it just says whatever k is, and in this case, our k is -5. And so this is what it's looking for, is what is that highest or lowest point? Now, if I was to graph this equation, I would get the graph the same way. Like if I was going y is equal to, let me clear these out. If I was to graph it, I would get the same thing. Notice that if I was to graph x plus 2, and I'm not asking you to graph it, but I just want you to understand, like, why am I doing this? Why does it matter? And because at some point coming up soon, you are going to have to graph quadratics, and this is a nice way to get to that point. So when I graph this, notice that there's my u, notice that it faces up, and also notice that this lowest point is -2, -5, which is where I said my vertex was. Now, could I have done that a different way? Yeah. I could have said, well, what if I just wanted to graph my original equation to begin with? Which I can do. Not a big deal. So if I graph my original equation, I have x squared plus 4x minus 1. When I graph this, it should just go right on top of my other graph because it's the same graph. All right. This is just another way for you to figure out what that vertex point is without having to graph it and then calculate, because right now, this one's an easy one. You can calculate it fairly easy by looking at the grid, but you don't know it exact. And so completing the square helps you find that value exact. All right, so the next thing that they ask us to do is find the maximum value. And so remember, a maximum value means that my u is going to go upside down, and you have a highest point here. And the only thing that changes is that your equation is going to have a negative out in front. It's -a x minus h squared plus k. And that's the only thing that's different, is there's a negative out in front. So when you have your x squared being a negative, remember I said you have to have a be positive in order to complete the square. So that means I have to divide everything by -1 or divide it out, write it out in front in order for me to do this. So I've got -1, and this is going to become positive x squared, -2x, and then -7. So I take the -1 out of everything, and now I'm going to do exactly what I did before. Okay, and I notice that I'm going to do a bracket here. I'm going to do that for a reason. So this is -2x. I'm going to try to figure out what I'm going to add and subtract in order to get this to be a perfect square. So I'm still doing that same idea of I need a perfect square.
Oh, I didn't like the recommendation.
What was that? So we're taking the middle term, dividing it by 2, and squaring it. So this is -1 squared, which is 1. So I add 1, subtract 1, just like I did before, because 1 minus 1 is 0, didn't change anything. So from here, I'm going to group the first two and rewrite it. And that is why I do the parenthesis or the bracket there instead of parentheses. Is I need to realize or remember that this -1 is sitting out here and needs to be redistributed or given to everything inside eventually. So I'm going to rewrite this. And again, it's step 2. So this is x minus 1. And when I combine these little two, I get -8. And again, that little -1 with the bracket helps me remember that. And I now have to give the -1 to both terms inside. So this is going to be -1 times the parentheses, which is -1 times x minus 1 squared. And then -1 times -8 is +8. So now when I look for that max point or the vertex point, however we want to write that, we're going to do that same idea. We're going to take the value that's inside, so the opposite of what's inside. So the opposite of -1 is +1, and the number on the outside is 8. And so if I was to graph this, which I'm going to spare you that, if I was to graph this in the calculator, unless you want to see it, my highest point would be 1/8. Do we feel okay about that? Any questions? Okay, you guys have about, 20 minutes? I think that we're gonna kind of pause there or be done. The only other thing that you guys see, I think, on your notes is example 6. I would like you to read through that at some point, but what it just tells you is that based off the picture and the equation, you should be able to eliminate some of them. Because it goes down, that means that you can eliminate that one because it was a positive A. And then the other thing that you could eliminate is, like, you know that this one means you have x-intercepts at +2 and +8 if you were to solve. So that one kind of checks out. That might be about 2 and about 8. So that might be okay. This one tells you that your vertex is at 5, +9. Again, that could be 5, 9. Like, I would be okay with that. Like, maybe. Seems okay. So I'm okay with these two. But then I look at this one, and this one tells me my vertex is the opposite of 4, which is -4 and 8, which means my vertex would be over here somewhere. So I don't like that one. So between these two, you could graph and try to figure out which one it is, or maybe it's both. Maybe g of x and p of x is the same graph, because both of them, based off the picture, would work. And so that's kind of all example 6 is saying. And then you've got a couple of real life applications, which is just still using that idea of writing it in vertex form to find the maximum height of a rocket, which we will talk about this again later on this year. And so I'm just going to skip the real life application for right now, just to give you some time to get going on your assignment. Again, I sent you all an email. Let me stop this really quick. I sent you all an email about tomorrow. So make sure that you guys are okay